Welcome to True Echo, where every story echoes the truth behind human dignity, injustice, and redemption. In a world quick to judge by appearances, we bring you real, raw, and deeply emotional tales inspired by true events and social realities. Stories that start with discrimination, but end with unexpected redemption. If you believe in justice, second chances, and the power of change, you're in the right place. The rhythmic hum of JFK International Airport at rush hour was an orchestra of chaos. Luggage wheels clattering, boarding calls echoing, travelers shouting over each other in dozens of languages. But within that relentless noise, a single jarring crack pierced the air. Not the metallic groan of a delayed flight or the buzz of a final call, but the sharp, unmistakable sound of a slap. Every head turned. At gate 27, silence slammed into the atmosphere like a tidal wave. A cane spun out of an elderly woman's hand, clattering hard against the marble floor. Her pale blue eyes blinked in shock, then steadied as she raised her hand, not to strike back but simply to regain her balance. Caroline Whitmore, the flight attendant in question, stood stiffly, her manicured fingers still hovering mid-air. Her face was taut with disdain, the words already tumbling out of her mouth before reason could catch up. "I told you to step aside. First class is not for people like you," she said, each word slicing through the air with deliberate cruelty. Passengers froze, eyes wide, mouths agape. Some clutched their boarding passes tighter, others simply stood still, trying to comprehend what they'd just seen. A child dropped his toy. A man pulled out his phone. But no one spoke. Not yet. The woman who had been struck, elegant despite her age, her outfit a muted emerald with a silver scarf draped with dignified precision, reached slowly for her cane. She moved with grace, not weakness. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "You've just made a serious mistake in your career," she said, her voice soft but forceful. Like velvet-wrapped steel. Her name was Evelyn Crawford. And while most didn't recognize her face, the name alone carried weight in boardrooms and shareholder meetings across the globe. But Caroline hadn't asked for her name. She hadn't cared. To her, Evelyn had just been another passenger with dark skin, aged hands, and what she assumed was a fake ticket. A woman to dismiss. Caroline's lips curled. "Do you think you can intimidate me with empty threats? I know my job." But Evelyn simply looked at her, a gaze so calm and composed it became terrifying. She said nothing more. She didn't have to. Across the gate, Sebastian Hartley watched everything unfold. A young entrepreneur and frequent first-class flyer, he had been seated in the VIP lounge earlier that afternoon. He remembered Evelyn. She had been sitting alone by the window watching the planes take off like someone who understood the weight of flight, not just in physics but in freedom. Sebastian hadn't spoken to her then. But he had noticed her. There was something about her presence. The kind of quiet that comes not from timidity, but from a lifetime of knowing how to wait for the right moment to speak. And this was her moment. Julia Monroe, another flight attendant, had just arrived near the gate and caught sight of the confrontation. She was younger than Caroline, with sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes. As she glanced between the gathered crowd and her colleague's rigid stance, her expression twisted into confusion. "What's going on?" she asked under her breath. Caroline didn't respond. Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat, producing a sleek leather ticket holder. She extended it, not with aggression but with patience, like a teacher giving a final chance. "This is my first-class boarding pass," Evelyn said. "Seat 1A. Issued by this airline." Caroline snatched it. She read the name. Her lips tightened. Her eyes darted between the ticket and Evelyn's calm expression, and for a flickering second, her mask cracked. But then the pride returned. "This doesn't prove anything," she barked, now loudly enough that the crowd could hear again. "You could have faked it. We've had these incidents before. People sneaking into first class pretending to be someone they're not." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sebastian stood, his jaw clenching. Evelyn remained still. She didn't even blink. "If you're accusing me of fraud," she said, her tone still level, "then I suggest you call your supervisor. Now." Instead of complying, Caroline tore the ticket down the middle. Gasps rang out. Someone dropped their coffee. A few people pulled out phones and began filming, including Sebastian. Evelyn didn't shout. She simply turned to the security officer who had been watching from the side. "Please retrieve your senior gate manager," she said. And Richard Montgomery. That name, Richard Montgomery, hung in the air like a thundercloud. He was the airline's regional manager. Feared, respected, rarely seen outside the upper ranks of corporate affairs. The security officer blinked. "Yes, ma'am," he said and disappeared like a man sprinting for shelter. Caroline, still drunk on her indignation, raised her voice again. I don't know who you think you are, but I will not be intimidated by some dramatic. She didn't finish her sentence. Because just then Richard Montgomery arrived. Sharp suit. Dark eyes. A presence like a judge walking into a courtroom. He stopped the moment he saw Evelyn. And then he bowed. Not a shallow nod. A deep, reverent bow. Mrs. Crawford, he said, his voice controlled but undeniably shaken. Please forgive us. On behalf of the airline. The crowd gasped again. Caroline stumbled backward. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Sebastian's eyes widened. Abigail Miller, another passenger, a lawyer judging by her leather-bound planner and the sharp suit, covered her mouth in realization. Richard turned slowly toward Caroline. You didn't recognize her, he said almost to himself. You didn't even check. Caroline shook her head. I thought she was just what? Richard cut her off. Pause. Then Evelyn stepped forward. She thought I didn't belong. Because I don't look the part. Because I don't match the image she built in her mind of what a person of status, power, or dignity is supposed to look like. Her words weren't shouted, yet they cut deeper than a scream ever could. The gate was silent again. Then Evelyn looked at Richard. I'm not interested in ruining someone's career. But I am interested in teaching lessons that last longer than a termination. Richard nodded. Of course. We'll handle this accordingly. The story, however, was far from over. Because Evelyn Crawford didn't just own a seat on that plane. She owned the entire airline. Anne Caroline Whitmore had just slapped the hand of the woman who signed her paycheck. The silence that followed was not the kind that brought calm. It was heavy. Awkward. The kind that fills the air when truth enters a room and shame has nowhere to hide. Caroline's face had lost all color. Her lips twitched like she wanted to say something, anything, but she couldn't form the words. She just stood there, the torn ticket still trembling in her hand like an indictment she'd issued against herself. Evelyn Crawford didn't flinch. She simply took one step forward and said quietly, Richard, I'd like to board the plane now. I believe I have a seat waiting. Richard Montgomery stepped aside without hesitation, raising a hand to signal the path clear. Of course, Mrs. Crawford. Please, allow me to escort you personally. As Evelyn moved with her signature grace toward the boarding gate, Caroline instinctively reached out, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to defend herself. But she stopped herself just before her hand touched Evelyn's arm. That invisible line of consequence had become very real now. Evelyn didn't even look back. The murmurs from the crowd turned into low chatter, filled with disbelief, curiosity, and a strange kind of reverence. Most of them had never heard of Evelyn Crawford before, but they knew now, and they would not forget. As Evelyn disappeared down the jet bridge, Caroline stood frozen, staring at the floor. Her mind reeled with disbelief. She hadn't just insulted a wealthy passenger. She hadn't just ruined a first-class experience. She had assaulted and publicly humiliated the founder and CEO of the airline. Behind her, Julia Monroe approached, hesitant, unsure what to say. The tension had diffused just enough for a few passengers to begin whispering openly now. Did you hear that? She OWNS the airline, one said. That lady in green? I thought she was just, That attendant's finished, another muttered. She slapped a billionaire. Caroline didn't hear them. She couldn't. Her ears were buzzing. Her heart was racing. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. Instead, she slowly turned around and walked away from the gate, the sharp heels of her shoes clicking too loudly on the tile, echoing her guilt in every step. Inside the cabin, Evelyn sat in seat 1A as reserved. A flight attendant, not Caroline, not Julia, but a senior staff member named Rhea, approached cautiously, placing a glass of sparkling water on her table. If there's anything else we can do for you, ma'am, please say the word. Evelyn simply nodded and looked out the window. Just keep everything quiet. No fuss. Rhea understood. There was no need to explain. Sometimes dignity is its own request. As passengers trickled into the first-class cabin, some gave Evelyn long glances. Others pretended not to look at all but stole glances anyway. No one dared speak to her. Not yet. Her silence had become a presence of its own, heavier than anger, louder than outrage. From the rear of the cabin, Sebastian Hartley finally boarded and passed by her seat. He paused, hesitating, then took a step closer. Excuse me, Mrs. Crawford, he said, voice low and respectful. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. I'm sorry. Not for what you went through. I know I can't undo that. but sorry it even had to happen. So, in this world. Evelyn looked up at him, studied his face for a moment, then gave a small, knowing nod. Sometimes, she said, it takes someone else witnessing it to make it real. Thank you for not turning away. Sebastian's throat tightened. He nodded and moved on to his seat, his chest heavy. The scene at the gate wasn't just an embarrassing moment, it was a mirror. And everyone who had watched it unfold was now staring into it, seeing not just Caroline but parts of themselves. In the rear galley, Caroline stood with her back to the wall, trying not to shake. She'd been told to remain on board until the senior manager spoke with her directly. The official disciplinary meeting would be scheduled upon landing, but she knew, deep down, what was coming. She had crossed a line. Not just with a passenger. Not just with protocol. With herself. Julia Monroe walked past her with a tray and paused. You should say something, she whispered. To her. Caroline looked at her, eyes wild with fear. What am I supposed to say? Sorry I slapped the woman who signs my paycheck? Julia didn't smile. No. You say, I judged you. And I was wrong. That's a good start. Caroline said nothing. But her breath hitched. In the cockpit, the captain had already been informed of the incident. The co-pilot gave a tight-lipped summary to the crew over the intercom. Maintain utmost discretion during this flight. We have our airline's chairwoman on board. As the aircraft took off, a quiet unease floated through the cabin. First class was silent, not from comfort but reflection. The kind of stillness that settles only after something irreversible has happened. Half an hour later, a tap came at Evelyn's seat. It was Caroline. She stood in her uniform, eyes puffy but jaw set. Her hands clutched a napkin and a cup of tea, trembling slightly. I brought your tea, she said, voice hoarse. Evelyn glanced up, then down at the tea. I didn't order tea. I know, Caroline said. But I remember from the lounge earlier, you asked for black tea. No sugar. Lemon on the side. Evelyn blinked. That detail caught her off guard. She nodded. Thank you. Caroline didn't leave. She stood there for another second, then slowly, almost painfully, set the cup down on the table. I'm sorry, she said, barely audible. I'm not just sorry because I found out who you are. I'm sorry because I saw you. And I still didn't see you. Evelyn's lips parted slightly. I've worked for this airline for 10 years, Caroline whispered. And I thought I knew what professionalism meant. But today I let pride and prejudice replace decency. You didn't deserve that. No one does. Evelyn studied her, then looked away. No, they don't. Pause. I can't undo what I did, Caroline said. But if you can teach me how to be better, I'll learn. I'll show up. Evelyn looked at her again, really looked. This time, her gaze softened just slightly. Not forgiveness, but recognition. Then start here, she said. With your silence. Just listen. Serve. Watch. And if the opportunity ever comes for you to speak on someone else's behalf, don't stay quiet. Caroline nodded. No more words. She turned and walked away. Back at her seat, Evelyn lifted the cup and took a sip of the tea. It wasn't perfect. The lemon slices were too thin. The water a little too hot. But still, she drank it. Because change, like tea, begins with boiling. The jet soared over clouds that stretched like endless waves of snow beneath the sky. Inside, the silence in first class was different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was contemplative. Every passenger who had witnessed the incident at the gate was still seated, their postures straight, their expressions thoughtful. For the first time on a luxury flight, the real turbulence wasn't outside. It was internal. Evelyn Crawford sipped her tea slowly. Each movement was deliberate, elegant, yet restrained. There was nothing theatrical about the way she moved, but everyone noticed her anyway. That's the thing about people who carry their history in silence. You feel them before you understand them. From a few seats down, Sebastian Hartley watched her carefully. In his line of work, tech entrepreneurship and global consulting, he'd met his fair share of powerful individuals. But Evelyn was different. Her power didn't stem from her wealth or position. It came from her ability to command truth without needing to raise her voice. Abigail Miller, seated across the aisle, scribbled something into her journal. She was a civil rights attorney and had seen many courtroom apologies, many performative gestures. But what she witnessed in Evelyn wasn't a demand for retribution. It was the kind of accountability that made others want to rise to her level. Julia Monroe returned to the first-class cabin, her role now shifted. At Richard Montgomery's request, and Evelyn's measured consent, Julia had been reassigned mid-flight to serve only Evelyn for the remainder of the journey. Not out of cruelty, but to learn. to listen, and maybe, just maybe, to begin again. She walked slowly toward Evelyn's seat, pausing just before reaching her. Her uniform no longer gave her the authority it once did, it was just fabric now. She gently adjusted the blanket over Evelyn's legs and whispered, "Are you comfortable?" Evelyn turned to her, her gaze unreadable. "Yes, thank you." Julia nodded, hesitating. "Would you like a fruit tray?" Evelyn nodded once, her tone calm. "Yes. Pineapple if available. And no strawberries." Julia's eyes flickered. Understood. She turned and walked away. No praise. No warmth. But no coldness either. Just a task fulfilled. One brick in the road back to dignity. In the galley, Julia leaned against the counter, her hands shaking slightly. She had served thousands of passengers before. Celebrities, CEOs, diplomats. But nothing had shaken her like this. Not because Evelyn was powerful, but because Evelyn had shown her mercy. Julia could still feel the sting in her chest from the question Evelyn had asked during her apology. "Would you be saying any of this if I wasn't the CEO?" She hadn't been able to answer. Because the answer was no. Her remorse had been real, but it had come too late, only after the consequences had arrived wearing a name tag more powerful than hers. She looked down at the fruit tray she was preparing. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind drifted to every moment she had dismissed someone based on their looks. The woman in a hijab she had once ignored. The black couple in economy class she had assumed couldn't afford a seat upgrade. The elderly man she'd patronized for asking too many questions. Her reflection stared back from the metal panel of the microwave, pale and ashamed. Back in 1A, Evelyn watched clouds drift past the window. To the others she looked serene. But inside, her thoughts stirred like the wind above a storm-torn ocean. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. Because this wasn't the first time. And she knew it wouldn't be the last. She'd spent decades carving her way through boardrooms where she was the only black woman in a sea of men. Decades hearing her voice dismissed until profits proved her right. Decades dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, so her identity couldn't be weaponized against her. And still, all it took was one slap to remind her how fragile that dignity was in the eyes of others. But she didn't cry. She never did. She had grown too accustomed to being the one who couldn't afford to cry. Instead she breathed. And remembered something her mother once told her: "They can take your seat. They can tear your paper. But they can't rewrite your truth." 30 minutes later, Julia returned with the fruit tray. She placed it gently on the table, then stood back, unsure if she should speak. Evelyn looked up. "No strawberries," Julia said, a quiet pride in her voice, almost like a child who had finally done something right. Evelyn raised an eyebrow slightly. "Thank you." Julia hesitated again. "Mrs. Crawford, I've been thinking about something you said. About questioning people's ability because of their skin." Evelyn said nothing, allowing the moment to stretch. I've never had to prove I belong anywhere. People look at me and assume I do," Julia admitted. "And when I saw you, something in me just assumed you didn't. I don't know why. I didn't even see the ticket. I only saw my own assumptions." "That," Evelyn said, her voice low and calm, "is the problem." Julia's throat tightened. "I want to change," she said. Evelyn nodded. "Then start by acknowledging the bias, not just in yourself but in the systems that created you." Julia looked at her hands. "Can I ask you something?" "You can try," Evelyn replied. "What would you have done if you weren't the CEO? If you were just another passenger, no title, no power?" Evelyn leaned back. "I would have picked up my cane, walked away, and added it to the 100 other moments like it I've endured quietly. That's what most of us do." Julia swallowed hard. "That's not right." "No," Evelyn agreed. "But it's real." And there it was, the quiet truth that burned more than any reprimand. As the plane began its descent, the first-class cabin shifted with the subtle movements of people returning trays, lifting seats, preparing for landing. But this time no one moved with haste. It was as if every passenger had been changed by something they didn't see coming. Because real transformation doesn't start with a policy. It starts with a moment. And Julia Monroe's moment had just begun. The landing gear deployed with a soft mechanical groan, and the plane glided toward the runway, the lights of the city shimmering beneath the cloud layer like constellations waiting for their moment. Inside the cabin, a different kind of turbulence lingered, not in the air but in the hearts of the passengers. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be touching down at JFK in approximately 7 minutes. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Julia Monroe stood in the galley, her hands braced against the counter. Every word Evelyn Crawford had spoken to her during the flight still rang in her ears. Not like a lecture. Not like a punishment. But like a mirror. And what she saw in it? She barely recognized herself. For 10 years she had taken pride in her professionalism. Sharp uniform, perfect posture, memorized passenger names. But today, stripped of her assumptions and position, she realized she'd been hiding behind routine, blind to the harm she was capable of. And Evelyn hadn't humiliated her. She'd offered her something infinitely harder to accept. The truth. Cabin secure, Julia mumbled into the intercom, but her voice cracked slightly. She composed herself, smoothed her hands down her skirt, and walked slowly back to 1A. Evelyn sat, seatbelt fastened, gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the window. The glow from the city's skyline cast long shadows across her face, outlining her jaw, her eyes, the proud curve of her chin. Julia leaned down. "Miss Crawford, thank you for letting me serve you today." Evelyn didn't turn. "You weren't serving me, Julia. You were serving the moment." Julia nodded quietly and returned to her jump seat, the plane now descending through the misty haze above New York. The wheels touched the tarmac with a gentle bounce. The cabin shook slightly. Then stillness. A collective breath released as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. But for some, the landing was just the beginning. Caroline Whitmore, the flight attendant who had slapped Evelyn and ripped her ticket, was seated in the rear of the cabin, awaiting the moment she'd be escorted to her disciplinary review. She hadn't spoken another word since takeoff. Her body slumped, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. A prisoner of her own thoughts. In her mind, the moment kept replaying, the slap, the words she uttered, the silence that followed. The revelation. The name, Evelyn Crawford. A name that now echoed like a verdict in her head. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder in flight service, always obsessed with order, with standards. But it was only now she saw what she had confused for discipline was actually prejudice in disguise. Her face, once proud and polished, was now pale and worn with regret. A chime signaled the final stop. Passengers stood, gathered their belongings, but no one rushed. There was a reverence in the air. An invisible ripple left behind by the story that had unfolded mid-flight. In first class, Evelyn remained seated. Richard Montgomery, who had boarded quietly before landing, now stepped forward to address the cabin personally. His voice was calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We apologize for any disruption earlier and want to assure you that our airline is committed to upholding the values of respect and dignity, for all." There was a murmur of agreement from some. From others, silence. Then, unexpectedly, Richard looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Crawford, would you like to disembark first?" She shook her head gently. "Let the others go. I'll follow after." Richard nodded and turned back toward the aisle, ushering the line forward. As passengers passed by Evelyn, some stopped. Sebastian Hartley paused, his carry-on bag in hand. "You changed more than one life today," he said. "Including mine." Evelyn smiled softly. "Good. Then don't let it stop here." He nodded and moved on. Abigail Miller followed next. "If you ever want to co-author a piece on restorative justice, I'd be honored." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I'll consider it." Passenger after passenger passed her seat, not out of pity but respect. A woman who had quietly turned humiliation into transformation. Not with anger. Not with shame. But with presence. Down at the terminal gate, a security officer waited discreetly. When Julia and Caroline finally stepped off the aircraft, they were led toward the private wing of the terminal, a glass corridor typically reserved for VIPs. But today it was for reflection. They entered a meeting room with frosted windows and silent walls. At the head of the table sat Stephen Caldwell, vice president of the airline, alongside Evelyn herself. Evelyn stood only once Caroline had entered. Caroline froze in place, guilt washing over her in waves. Her voice cracked. I don't expect forgiveness." Evelyn held up a hand. "I'm not here to forgive. I'm here to decide what comes next. For you. For this airline. And for how we train our people to carry more than coffee and peanuts. To carry humanity." Caroline blinked through tears. "I failed," she whispered. "And not just you." Evelyn nodded. "Yes. But now comes the question that matters most. What are you going to do with that failure?" The room fell silent. Stephen leaned forward. We're proposing a re-education program, mandatory for all flight crew. Cultural sensitivity. Implicit bias. Restorative justice. Evelyn added, and Caroline, you will be the first to complete it. Not because it's punishment, but because transformation begins with you. Caroline's shoulders sank in relief and remorse all at once. Thank you, she said. I won't waste it. Evelyn stepped forward, looked her in the eye. I believe that. And in that moment, no uniforms, no titles, no positions mattered. Just a human being facing the wreckage of who they once were, and choosing who they might become. Weeks passed. The story had already gone viral by the time the plane's wheels touched down that night. By the next morning, hashtags like hashtag Evelyn Crawford, hashtag CO in disguise, and hashtag silent dignity were trending across platforms. News anchors debated the power dynamics. Pundits praised her poise. But Evelyn Crawford herself? She stayed quiet. No interviews. No public statements. Just a single internal memo to the airline's executive board titled, Silence Can Teach. Now let's speak. And she meant it. Because Evelyn wasn't interested in performative apologies or short-lived outrage. She wanted change, measurable, meaningful, and uncomfortable. So she began with something radical, vulnerability. The first thing she did was require every airline employee, from the baggage handlers to board executives, to attend empathy and equity immersion training, a program she had helped design herself. The second, she requested that Julia Monroe be assigned to the pilot phase of the program. Not because Julia had served her punishment, but because Evelyn believed that stories don't end at apology, they begin at accountability. It was a rainy Monday when Julia arrived at the training center. No uniform this time. Just jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and a notebook tucked under her arm. She looked around the minimalist classroom, soft lighting, semicircular seating, a whiteboard that read, "The hardest mirror is the one you can't look away from." There were 9 other attendees that day. Flight attendants, ticketing agents, even a marketing associate. At the front stood a man with calm eyes, salt and pepper hair, and a warmth that didn't try too hard. "Welcome," he said. "This isn't just training. It's reflection. It's reconstruction. And for some of us, it may feel like demolition before the rebuild begins." Julia felt her throat tighten. She nodded, then sat in the second row. The instructor continued. "You've all been selected not because you're the worst, but because you're willing. And willingness," he said with a pause, "is rarer than talent." Over the following weeks, Julia was pulled into a reality she had never had to see up close before. She watched testimonial videos from passengers, some famous, many not, recounting moments they'd been profiled, dismissed, or humiliated in transit. She read historical breakdowns of systemic discrimination in the airline industry. She listened to coworkers who looked nothing like her describe the everyday microaggressions they faced, often from people who never even realized they were doing harm. But it wasn't until week 4 that she broke. It was a module titled, When I Stopped Belonging. A black woman named Deirdre, a retired flight captain, stood in front of the class and described her early years in aviation, being mistaken for cleaning crew, enduring sexual harassment masked as locker room talk, and being overlooked for international routes despite outperforming her peers. Julia sat in the back of the room, her hands balled into fists, her chest tight with something she couldn't yet name. It wasn't just shame. It was grief. The grief of realizing you've lived in a system built on assumptions, and you never once asked who paid the price. After the session, Julia stayed behind. She approached Deirdre with shaking hands. "I've been part of the problem," she said quietly, "and I think I've only just started to realize how deep it goes." Deirdre studied her, then smiled, not kindly but knowingly. "That's the beginning," she said. "But don't stop here. Let it take you apart. Piece by piece. Because the woman you're supposed to be isn't built yet. She's waiting on the other side of this pain." At the end of 6 weeks, Evelyn returned. Not in corporate attire. Not with cameras. Just Evelyn, wearing a gray sweater, black slacks, and a calm gaze that scanned the classroom without judgment. She stepped to the front. "I know most of you have read the story, watched the footage, formed opinions. That's fine," she said. "But I didn't come here to be a symbol. I came here to ask a question." She looked around, pausing to let the weight of her words settle. "What does belonging look like when no one's watching?" No one answered. "I don't mean diversity quotas or inclusive slogans," Evelyn continued. "I mean the moment someone enters your space and you ask yourself, why do I feel the way I feel about this person?" Then she turned to Julia. "You've had to sit with that question. I'd like you to answer. Julia stood slowly, heart thudding in her chest. When I first saw you, she began, I saw someone who didn't belong in the lounge. Not because of your behavior, but because of my assumptions. My filters. My ignorance. She paused, trembling slightly. And when you didn't apologize for existing, I felt threatened. Because I mistook confidence in a black woman for arrogance. And I thought authority was something only people like me could hold. The room was dead silent. And now? Evelyn asked. Julia looked down. Then up again. Now I know that respect isn't earned by how someone dresses. It's demanded by their presence. And my job is to make sure that presence is never denied again. Evelyn didn't smile. But her eyes glistened. Then keep going, she said. Because someone like me will walk into your aisle again one day. And I want to know you'll see them. That night, Julia sat at her kitchen table, staring at her name badge. She turned it over slowly in her hand, remembering what it had once meant to her. Order, pride, power. Now it meant something else. Responsibility. She didn't know if Evelyn would ever consider her redeemed. But she knew one thing. The woman who once slapped a hand holding a boarding pass now understood what that moment had really torn. And she would spend the rest of her life piecing it back together, passenger by passenger, word by word, choice by choice. Julia Monroe returned to work exactly 92 days after that flight. The day she'd slapped a woman's hand and torn a future she couldn't see. But she wasn't the same person who left. The airline had quietly reinstated her, not as a senior attendant, but as a junior crew member on domestic flights. No ceremony. No announcement. Just a silent understanding. Redemption must be earned through repetition, not recognition. Her first day back was on Flight 204 to Charlotte. It was a short route, a light load, just under 2 hours. But to Julia, it felt like the longest flight of her career. As she adjusted the cabin pillows and secured the galley equipment, she felt the weight of every glance from her new co-workers. Some nodded politely. Others barely looked at her. She understood. Trust, like a shattered teacup, could be mended, but the cracks would remain. And maybe they should. Because cracks made you careful. They reminded you to be better. The lead attendant, Marisol, a middle-aged Filipino woman with a reputation for kindness, approached her during prep. You nervous? She asked softly, glancing at Julia's shaking hands. Julia nodded. Terrified. Marisol smiled. Good. That means you care now. When the passengers began to board, Julia stood by the entryway, her posture attentive but humble. She greeted each guest with warmth, not the mechanical kind she'd perfected over 10 years, but something more grounded. She looked people in the eye, not past them. Row after row filled, and Julia moved through the motions of pre-flight safety checks. But something shifted when she reached seat 11C. An elderly black woman sat there with a soft gray wrap around her shoulders, her eyes kind but wary. Julia knelt slightly and smiled. Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you with anything before we take off? The woman looked up slowly. No, thank you. I'm fine. But her eyes lingered. They studied Julia, not with suspicion but with quiet curiosity. And Julia understood. This woman didn't know her story. But she recognized the type. Julia bowed her head slightly. I just want you to know, she said gently, I'm here to make sure this flight feels safe, dignified, and calm for everyone. Especially you. The woman blinked. Then nodded, her mouth twitching into a tiny, approving smile. Then let's fly, she said. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, Evelyn Crawford sat in a small conference room, not as CEO this time but as mentor. Before her sat 8 department heads, all invited personally by her for a session she called the second layer. What happened on Flight 934 wasn't just a scandal, Evelyn said. It was a signal. A warning. That something was broken, not just in one person but in all of us who let it get that far. The heads of HR, marketing, and training exchanged glances. Evelyn continued. We issued statements. We sent emails. But now we need a system. Something permanent. Something painful. She outlined a 3-step plan. Perspective rotation, requiring every executive to spend 3 working days each year shadowing frontline staff, from cleaning crews to gate agents. Anonymous empathy reports, a portal where employees could document racial microaggressions or class-based mistreatment, reviewed monthly by a neutral panel. Immersion story workshops, based on real passenger incidents, where flight crew would walk through simulations and role reversals, guided by experts in trauma and diversity education. The room was silent. Evelyn looked at each of them. If you're here for optics, leave now. This isn't about checking boxes. This is about changing culture. No one left. Back on Flight 204, Julia stood in the aisle during beverage service, approaching row 9. A young Latino boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered. The lady with the drinks smiled at me. Julia heard it, and her eyes welled with something she hadn't felt in months: peace. She crouched next to him. "Do you want apple juice or orange juice, Captain?" The boy giggled. "Apple." She handed it to him and whispered, "Every great pilot starts with juice and dreams." His mother smiled quietly. "Gracias," she said. Julia nodded. "Siempre." That evening, after landing and final cabin checks, Julia sat alone in the crew lounge, her feet aching but her heart calm. She pulled out a small notepad Evelyn had once given her, the cover embossed with only 3 words: "Earn it back." She opened to the first blank page and wrote, "Day 1, saw people. Not passengers. Day 1, served with presence. Day 1, listened more than I spoke." She paused, then underlined the words. Day 1, didn't hide. The door creaked open. Marisol peeked in. "Heading out?" she asked. "In a second," Julia said. "Just finishing something." Marisol smiled. "You're doing good, Julia." "Really?" Julia closed the notebook. "I'm trying. And I'll keep trying." Outside the lounge, the sky had faded into dusk. The runway lights blinked in silent rhythm, like heartbeats across concrete. And Julia, once the face of an unforgivable mistake, walked into the fading light with no applause, no redemption speech, just a quiet promise in her steps. One flight at a time. 6 months had passed. Winter melted into spring, and with it came subtle changes across the airline. The uniforms hadn't changed, but the eyes behind them had. Training modules weren't just checklists, they were conversations. Pilots sat in on empathy seminars. Executives took unscheduled walks through economy class. And Evelyn Crawford? She didn't just lead from her office. She led from presence. Once a month, she boarded flights as an anonymous passenger, blending in with the crowd, wearing simple scarves and sensible shoes, always carrying that same cane, the symbol of both elegance and endurance. Most didn't recognize her. But they always remembered her. Because Evelyn wasn't just inspecting performance. She was watching for compassion. Julia Monroe stood before a group of new recruits in a small training hall just outside Dallas. She wore no flight attendant uniform now. Her outfit was soft blue, approachable, modest. But her posture still held the elegance of years in the air. "Welcome to Flight Culture 101, she began, writing the words on a whiteboard. Then she paused. "Let me ask you something. How many of you believe you can tell who belongs in first class just by looking at them?" The room was still. No one raised a hand. Julia smiled. "Good. Then you're already miles ahead of where I started." She walked slowly across the room. 6 months ago, I made a mistake that cost me everything. My role, my reputation, and more painfully, my sense of self. I slapped a woman's hand because I thought I was protecting an image. But I was really protecting a lie, that status can be seen, and dignity can be earned. She let the silence hang for a moment. The woman I slapped wasn't just a passenger. She was the CEO. The founder. The very reason my job existed. But she didn't fire me. She gave me something harder. Julia turned to the board again and wrote 2 words. The mirror. She held it up. And I had to look. Not once. But every day since. One of the recruits raised a hand. "How did you recover from that?" Julia paused, thoughtful. "I didn't recover," she said honestly. "I transformed. And that's a process. You don't graduate from it. You grow into it. Day by day." Back at headquarters, Evelyn Crawford stood in the boardroom, looking over quarterly reports. One line caught her eye. Crew satisfaction plus 18%. Passenger complaints minus 24%. Spontaneous compliments plus 41%. She smiled. Not for the numbers. For the meaning behind them. This was more than PR. More than damage control. This was culture, bending, breaking, and being rebuilt in real time. Richard Montgomery entered the room. "She's teaching now," he said. "Julia. They say she's the best we've got." Evelyn didn't look up. She should be. That kind of lesson, when it burns enough, it becomes gospel. Richard nodded. "You ever think about retiring?" Evelyn closed the file. "No. Not yet. There's still too much rebuilding to do." 2 days later, Evelyn boarded Flight 1105 to San Francisco. Row 1A was hers again, though this time she didn't sit right away. She turned to the woman greeting her at the cabin door. It was Julia. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. But something passed between them. Not warmth. Not closure. Something better. Understanding. Julia stepped aside, offering her arm slightly. "Welcome aboard, Miss Crawford," she said, her voice calm. "We're honored to have you." Evelyn nodded. "And I'm honored to be here," she said, then stepped inside. As the plane took off, clouds wrapped around the fuselage like blankets of memory. Evelyn looked out the window and breathed, not with relief but with hope. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. But she knew what today had delivered. A story rewritten. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Evelyn Crawford taught us that real power isn't loud. It's steady. That justice doesn't always wear a badge. It wears a cane, a calm gaze, and the courage to ask the hard question. Would you have apologized if I had no title? No status? No voice? Julia Monroe's journey is a reflection for all of us. That prejudice often hides in professionalism, and redemption begins not with being right, but being willing to be wrong. So we ask you, have you ever judged someone before you knew their story? Would you have had the courage Evelyn showed, not to retaliate but to rebuild? Let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts, your truths, and if this story moved you, share it. Someone out there needs to see this today. Subscribe to True Echo for more stories that dig deep, challenge comfort, and leave behind something that echoes. Because the strongest stories aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that change us quietly. Forever.